And welcome back. So it's been a little while since we've uploaded our last video. I wanted to apologize for that delay there. We were out of town for a little bit, and upon returning from being out of town and wanting to get right back onto the project, at least starting with myself, got nabbed by the you-know-what bug. And I want to mention that bug because YouTube's algorithm gets a little bit weird when it picks up on that particular keyword, but considering what the world's been going through for the last 2 years, that should give you the clue you need right there. So it's pretty much laid me out for a good little while here, starting to get my strength back at this point. At least helped get out and get the grass cut today, and to give you an idea, just getting the grass cut was enough to wipe me out for the rest of the day. So still very much fatigued, but again, strength is returning, getting there. And our plan is to get back on the build this upcoming week. But we have been doing some things that we can do, at least here on the sidelines. And one of them is if you remember the state that we left the truck in, I'm just going to put the tripod down here just so the camera isn't sitting there shaking or jerking. The state that we left the motor in, if you remember last time, was that the number 1 and number 7 cylinders were showing problems. So we were able to, if you remember, diagnose the engine, get the failed parts replaced, and get it started. But the number 1 cylinder had problems when the engine comes down to idle, showing an active misfire. And the number 7 cylinder will show an active misfire at high RPMs. So the little bit of testing we did with the compression gauge in the last video showed that as we were compression testing the number 1 cylinder, if you remember, we only got about 83 psi of compression out of that cylinder, which is not good. It needs to at least be 120 or higher. And one thing I mentioned that we would do, which we've done here, is ordered a leak down test kit. Now this particular kit to show you here is from OTC. There's the part number there. There'll be a link in the description of where I got this on Amazon. I got it at what I thought was a pretty good price, especially for it being a name brand tool, so I went ahead and picked it up. I've got other OTC stuff that I'm happy with. So that's an OTC 5609. I'm not sure who it's made by, but I'm sure it's made by someone else, more than likely. There's just a little note in the case letting you know that the test hose that you hook up between the cylinder and the gauge, if we pull our gauges out here, is inside the lip of the case. It's not the world's most ideal case. It gets the job done. It stores everything. I'd have just maybe liked it if the case was a little bit bigger, and this was, maybe stored off to the side like you see these adapter bits here for the various different spark plug wells or other things you may do a pressure leak down test with. But you can see there's our hose here. Business end that goes into the spark plug well or into an adapter, which then goes into the spark plug well, and then of course the piece end that goes into our gauge. And we'll get into more of this when we actually go to use this tool, but just to show you. So for example, in the instructions they say they don't want you to put any more than 100 psi into that cylinder. So we got 2 pressure gauges here. There's going to be a source pressure with a regulator, where we can regulate the amount of shop air we're feeding into our gauge. So I'm going to set this right to be about 90 psi in our gauge. Excuse me. Like I said, still getting over stuff. This is going to show the amount of pressure inside the cylinder that we're testing. So the way it works is this. If I have this set to 90 and we come over here, maybe we're only seeing 80 out of that 90 psi we're feeding in, which means we're losing 10 pounds somewhere. If we come into our chart, so our source air is 90 psi, and let's say we're reading 80 psi on that gauge, come down to our formula, and I believe that says 11%. So we got 11% of leakage. And so that's going to tell us that you either got 11% of leakage, either at an intake valve, an exhaust valve, or through the piston rings. So we're going to use this on our number one cylinder. We're going to take the valve cover off. We're going to rotate the engine over until we see that the intake and exhaust valves are closed, aka meaning that the number one cylinder has come up on top dead center if it's compression stroke, and then we're going to do our test from there. And that's going to allow us to feed in, like I said, we're going to feed in 90 pounds of shop air. We're going to see how much blow by we're getting looking at our second gauge. So we're either going to be losing air through the intake valve, the exhaust valve, or potentially past the piston rings into the crankcase. So we're going to be listening for air coming out of either the intake manifold, the exhaust manifolds, or we'll pop the oil fill off and see if we can listen for air, oil fill and or dipstick tube out, oil dipstick tube out, and check to see if we hear for any air that might be escaping through any of those avenues. Now, hopefully we find that it's just a valve that doesn't want to seat correctly, and we can take appropriate action. If we find out that we've got a piston ring that's just completely knackered at this point, then obviously the only fix for that is to pull that particular piston, perhaps even rework the bore, put a new set of piston rings on it. But if it gets to that point, then more than likely what we'll do is it will pull the 5.7 out of the red truck, do an upper end rebuild on it, and then put that into the 2009. And that will give us a block that, as long as it can still be remachined, the old block, we can potentially send that off to the machine shop, get it reworked, and use it for our purposes later. It may be built up, in other words, bigger pistons, supercharger, cam, the works, and get reworked into a very big, beefy, powerful 5.7 and get put back into the red truck. Or we may continue with one of the potential possibilities for the red truck is to do a built-up supercharged 6.4 and use that instead. So like I said, we've got some options here, but first thing we need to do is finish diagnosing why we're getting the compression loss on that number one cylinder. Now remember, number 7 cylinder, which brings us to our next tool. I'm just going to put this hose back in here, and that way we can put this away. That's why I don't like this case that much. I don't like having to fold this hose back into here. I much rather preferred it if they were to make this case a little bit bigger and just lay that hose kind of out flat more, but whatever, it's just my opinion. So another item we picked up again from OTC, I'll just get this cylinder tester out of the way so you can see this one. This is a injection pulse tester, also from OTC. You can see the number there is 3398. What this is going to do is something a little bit better than what the scan tool can do. I've seen this, you may have seen these before, but you can set the pulses. Looks like you've got a time scale here, basically, and the number of pulses per a set number of milliseconds. You can then attach it to that fuel injector, and then what we're going to do is this. We're going to get another one of our favorite fuel rail adapters. Again, these are used, and nitrous oxide systems use these in order to tap into the fuel rail to run additional fuel pressure sensors and switches and things of that nature. I find them useful in cases like this where, for whatever reason, they didn't give you a Schrader or a testing point in the fuel rail. Why, I don't know. We're going to use this like we've used before in other cases to put a fuel rail pressure tester back on that fuel rail. We're going to pressurize the fuel rail up. We're going to pulse it with our tester here. Excuse me. Then we're going to watch the pressure drop. And we're going to do this about twice. We don't want to do it too much because we don't want to wash the cylinder down with fuel. Then we're going to move the same tester over to a knowingly good cylinder, which has a knowingly good injector. We're going to pressurize the fuel rail again, and we're going to run the exact same test. And we're going to verify how much fuel pressure drops between the number 7 injector and a knowingly good injector. Now, another way you can do this is just to take a just take a knowingly good injector off another fuel rail, or swap it between another cylinder and, in a sense, do the same job. But what I want to see is when the number 7 is being triggered, like the PCM is going to trigger it, especially at high idle when it's firing faster to keep up with fuel needs. Is it performing? In other words, we know it's working, but is it working well enough to keep up, to be able to supply the needed amount of fuel to keep the ratio happy, so that way it fires and fires correctly? Because one thing that can also cause a misfire at high idle is if your mixture's off, if you're not getting enough air, or you're not getting enough fuel. It could also very well have nothing to do with the injector, because if you remember, the number 7 had a bent intake. It could have a sticky intake or exhaust valve. Lower RPMs, when it's not actuating that valve as much, it could be fine. Higher RPMs, it may be sticking and not closing as fast as it should, again causing that misfire issue. But this is why we need to test it, because we want to definitively know, is it an injector problem? So on and so forth. We know the compression in the number 7 cylinder is good because we're reading over 200. But that's the reason why we're also going to take the valve cover off, because we've got 2 cylinders, both on the driver's side. Having that valve cover off is also going to allow us to visibly inspect and make sure that we don't have a potential issue with the spring as well in either 1 or 7. So again, we've got items we can look into, and we've got a couple of new testing tools to add to our toolbox to be able to allow us to diagnose these things a bit further. And last but not least, another item that we went ahead and ordered in. You can see the part number there. What these are is that this particular model of 2009 1500 has 3 blend door actuators. And if you remember, every time we put the key in, you can hear that one just kind of stripping its gears. It's also reporting back to the body control module as one of the blend doors is in fault because it can't return it to a home position. I didn't order 3 because I believe it's just the one that's showing as faulty. But again, that's what these are for. So we'll have at least one we can change out, and if we find another questionable one in there, we can go ahead and do the swap on that as well. So that just gives you a little bit of a quick update of kind of where we've been, what we've been doing. Again, just amassing parts, doing what we can here while everybody just kind of gets over this thing, starts feeling a little better, and starts feeling up to being able to get out there and work on this. So that's what we'll do. We'll bring you back. We're going to start diagnosing the number 1, the number 7 cylinder. Hopefully they're easy fixes. Hopefully it's stuff that we can address why it's on the truck. Whether that's the case or not, we'll utilize the functionality that we do have, because as you saw, it does start and run well enough that the next step will be to get it in here, get it on the garage, get it on the lift. That way we can continue to work on it, during periods of bad weather or in the evening hours, whereas right now it's outside, so we're forced into fair weather type activities. In other words, we're looking for periods where it doesn't rain. We're looking for periods where it isn't, we're not out there excessively melting in the heat, so on and so forth. And we've had a lot of rain here in the last couple of weeks, and that's also kind of hindered us from being able to go out there and kind of do a lot with it. But again, I'm rambling on, but I just want to apologize and kind of show you that that's kind of why we've been where we've been. And let me just get you straightened up here. And a little bit of a mess. So that's where we've been and why we've been, and a little bit of a delay here. Like I said, we're all just kind of getting over this thing, and we'll get right back on this next week, and you can start to see some more of the normal content coming back then. But if you've stood it out this long, if you have not subscribed already, please consider to do so. We're right on that cusp of 1,000 users. That is our goal by the end of this year, to be at that mark. That will allow us to continue to bring the channel into the next phase of operation, so to speak, and allows us just to, again, do things such as get new tools in, get new parts in, and kind of go further and further and further into these rebuilds and into these repair procedures. So with that being said, I'll let you go, and I'll talk to you later. Thank you much. Bye.